Food isn't like medicine. It is medicine. And if you eat the standard American diet, also known as the SAD, you will get the standard American diseases.
I think it's ridiculous that we kind of exclude prevention from this conversation. There's a pervasive incentive issue in the country, and I think we must talk about that.
I'm Christina Farr.
I'm Ash Sanoos.
And I am Luba Greenwood. Welcome to Second Opinion, a podcast for digital health insiders from Second Opinion Media and Turpentine. Each week, we navigate what's really going on in healthcare through unfiltered conversations with entrepreneurs and investors that are leading the charge.
This season, we're tackling meaty topics like biosecurity, the latest in telemedicine, why patient acquisition is so hard, and the pros and cons of VC versus private equity.
I've covered the industry now for a decade as a former journalist with CNBC turned investor with Omas Ventures. And with my good friends Ash and Luba, we are developing a show at Second Opinion that brings real experts into the ring and asks them the tough questions that you've been dying to know in digital health.
Exactly, Chrissy. Ash brings her experience as a physician, as an executive in government and big tech, and healthcare CEO at many companies.
And Luba's background as a lawyer, investor, biotech CEO, and managing partner at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute Venture Fund adds another layer. What's that joke? An investor, a lawyer, and a doctor walk into a bar and...
Anyways, it leads to a lot of truth-telling. Fun fact, I originally met these two in the bathroom line while we were trying to put on lipstick at a healthcare conference. And now here we are. Join us at Second Opinion.
Let's dive in.
So today here on the podcast, we have Robin Berzin, who is the CEO of Parsley Health. And she and I have been friends going back a number of years now. We live nearby in New York. I'm constantly trying to convince her to move to my neighborhood because she is so much fun to have around. But she's also one of the foremost thinkers on really this idea that we're just not doing primary care right these days. We look at a patient as a set of organs very much on the surface, and we don't get into the real issues that may be contributing to what they're facing or take their symptoms seriously enough. So that's, I would say, Robin's kind of driving mission around what she's doing. But we'll talk to her about all kinds of things today. And as always, I have my co-hosts with me, Luba and Ash. So I'll kick us off with a question for you, Robin. So you've been a physician as well as being an entrepreneur. What was the set of experiences that you had as a physician that really led you to wanting to, I would say, scale yourself, be able to treat a lot more patients than you ever could on your own?
You know what? For me, it really started when I was in my residency and I was in the outpatient clinics and also on my inpatient floor service. And I saw that, at least from what I observed, we had unintentionally created a revolving door between primary care and specialty care that, at least for people with chronic diseases, the kinds of chronic conditions that are driving the vast, vast majority of our healthcare costs going skyward today, that this revolving door was just leading to them getting sicker and sicker, not better and better. Ultimately, they'd be hospitalized. They'd be on a ton of medications that were unsustainable to take. And I felt that we almost had like a missing service in the healthcare system, that there wasn't necessarily something wrong with primary care or wrong with specialty care or wrong with what we were doing in the hospital, but that those things were sort of missing a service that could allow for these patients with a lot of these conditions that are actually the kinds of conditions that can get better to get better. And I thought, well, if we're going to change the outcomes, we have to change the medicine. And so that's when I embarked in starting Parsley.
Robin, I love that you mentioned that, because when I speak to students that are in science and pre-med, and they go and they want to, at one point, go and become physicians, and then they're trying to decide between medical school or maybe a PhD program or maybe an MBA and go more of a healthcare startup, the thing that turns them off the most, it's exactly what you said. I'm so surprised you say it, you're right on. It's the revolving door. They sometimes shadow and they volunteer and they get to see what physicians, many of them, do day to day. And a lot of them get turned off right now, or ones that do become physicians get burned out. So I love that you mentioned that, and you've created a tool not just for patients to improve outcomes, but I would think for physicians to make this a better place to work and where they get more satisfaction of helping patients.
Definitely. Listen, patient care is hard. It's also deeply rewarding, and you have to love people and you have to love being hands-on. I I went through my own search process after college to think, do I want to be a doctor? What do I want to be? Right. My first job was actually as a paralegal at the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuting securities fraud. And I thought, I'm so glad someone does this, but I don't think it should be me. And so,
By the way, Robin, that is what I ended up doing. I was thinking
really,
and I ended up doing exactly that. So that's funny. I wouldn't have done it, but yes, I love it.
So you went on and did that. Thank you, by the way. Someone should definitely do that. It's an absolutely needed thing. But I get really interested in the body and health and wellness. And, my dad's a doctor, although I never thought I'd be a doctor. I wasn't pre-med in undergrad. But I went off and I left the law and I worked at NYU for a year in psych research, actually. I wasn't specifically interested in psych necessarily, but I just wanted hands-on patient care experience, and I got that there. And so that was really cool. And so then I sort of embarked on the process of figuring out how to get myself into medical school, which is no small feat for anyone who's done it. And I think you do really have to love people and patient care and being hands-on and those kinds of interactions. As draining as they can sometimes be, they are also maximally rewarding, and nothing makes me happier than I still see patients, by the way, at Parsley on the team. I saw patients this week on Thursday morning. I have a patient who's recovering from lung cancer, and we're working on her cholesterol. I have a patient who's also got a whole bunch of cardiovascular health issues, who's also dealing with a lot of family addiction issues. And it's deeply rewarding. But I do think there's sort of two kinds of doctors from what I'm observed, the ones who really stick with that hands-on approach. And then there's a couple of us crazy people who take a step back and look at the system after training and say, hey, I feel like there is something here that I really want to fix, maybe at scale.
That's a great segue into what I want to ask about, Robin. I actually heard about Parsley through my sister, who used your service because it was provided to her by her employer. So, for those of us who are listening who don't really know about Parsley and functional medicine versus traditional medicine, can you tell us a little bit about, what does Parsley do? Not that I want this to be an ad, but more so like, what's the difference between what you do and what everybody else does? And how are you finding it building this
Great
business?
question. Oh, well, that second question is like a whole nother, it's like a whole nother podcast. So what Parsley is, for anyone listening who's not familiar, we're an online clinic, we're a virtual clinic, we're in 50 states. We also have physical clinics in New York and LA. And what we do is something called functional medicine. Root cause medicine is another name for it. And what that means is we're really about finding and treating the root cause. And so our doctors actually have an additional training on top of their regular medical training. At Parsley, we actually built a fellowship to train doctors in this methodology. And what we train them to do is really a two-part thing. First, we do a very deep root cause analysis. We look at a data set that other doctors don't look at. So yes, we look at your history and your family history and your, conditions and medications. Of course, we take all of that in, but we also look at your childhood, everything that happened all the way up until now. We look at social determinants of health in a very deep way: what you're eating, how you're moving, your relationships, how you manage stress. Do you have meaning and purpose in your life? We do advanced diagnostic testing. We call it SMART testing. We understand that the body's an ecosystem. Sometimes that migraine or the brain fog or the depression is actually starting in your gut. And we train our doctors to do this kind of analysis, to put this data set together and to use it to treat our patients much more holistically. So yes, we prescribe drugs, and yes, we order tests, and yes, we refer for procedures when we need them, but we also prescribe highly personalized nutrition protocols, right? Because food isn't like medicine. It is medicine. And if you eat the standard American diet, also known as the SAD, you will get the standard American diseases. And so when we think about all those chronic diseases, patients that I saw in the hospital, and I was like, these people are getting worse and worse, and yet a lot of them could be getting better and better. Nutrition is an evidence-based lever that we have in that. And yet I didn't see anywhere else that at scale was putting nutrition and food on the prescription pad next to medications.
Why is that,
taken
Robin?
equally as seriously.
Shouldn't this be like standard part? I mean, I'm a physician, but I'm a specialist. And so, my training from primary care, internal medicine, it's been a while. But shouldn't we be looking at these things holistically? Like, why isn't this part of like general primary care or internal medicine or even specialist medicine, right? Like, why isn't this standard practice?
It wasn't historically, it wasn't the way that medicine sort of evolved to think about patient care. I think medicine evolved from a really good place, which is we have to triage this problem and fix it like right now, right? It's sort of managing the end stage. And now we live in an era in which the rising healthcare costs, right, the tsunami of healthcare costs that everybody talks about and says is totally unsustainable, and the physical symptoms and morbidity that goes along with that, right, are crushing us. And 25% of the workforce has not one, but two or more chronic conditions. And these folks are driving 70% of rising costs. And so when you look at that, I think we've evolved as a society into an era where we need a different approach to medicine. And so what you've seen is, the Institute for Functional Medicine training doctors in this methodology. You've seen the Cleveland Clinic invest in Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine. But what I hadn't seen was anyone try to scale it in clinical practice and also bring rigor and data to it. There are certainly amazing physicians and others practicing this way, kind of dotted around the country and the world. But what I hadn't seen was anyone bring an evidence-based, data-backed approach to standardizing this kind of care, showing that it works, which we've done. We have incredible validated outcomes data, and packaging it, right, pricing it, making it something that lots and lots of people could have. And so that's really kind of what I set out to do.
So I love that. I haven't actually seen anybody that does this. A lot of people, and I'd be curious. You probably will chuckle, or you do chuckle probably when you see people talk about AI and healthcare and learning from EMRs and getting insights from EMRs in order to identify a better path for therapy or a better path for managing a patient, especially with comorbidities. But that's not very helpful if the only data you're training your models on is from electronic medical records plus, let's say, labs, and the kind of labs, not the advanced diagnostics that you were talking about, but more of just the routine laboratory tests that many times, as you know, do not capture the data that is needed. Plus all the other data that you're, as you said, evidence-based approach and data collection across the different continuum of care and also across many metrics of what makes an individual. Family history, as you said, socioeconomic factors, the food and nutrition, mental health. So I love it. I guess so. I have from that two questions for you. Number one is, it seems to me that you do truly have a closed loop system to understand exactly what works and what improves care. So do you think that you're probably one of the few that can truly utilize artificial intelligence to understand a better pathway for care for patients? And is there anybody else that's doing it as well as you?
I think a lot of people are doing a lot of things really well, and I wouldn't pretend to be like an expert in AI. Although, ironically, I was on two panels on AI and healthcare at South by Southwest this year, where I was like, "Wow, I'm really honored to even be in this conversation, everyone." But I think that AI has huge promise to accelerate our ability to do real time, real world research. Right, the randomized controlled trial is a beautiful thing, but it's not enough. And when you look at how long it takes to get new information, I was just at a talk the other day and somebody shared that like the pap smear was developed in the 1920s, but didn't get put into clinical practice until the 1960s, right? It takes us a really long time in healthcare to do anything proactive and preventive. Sometimes we do things that are reactive a little bit faster. And so I think that Parsley does sit on a very unique data set that does not exist anywhere else in healthcare. And as we grow and as some of the AI tools that are out there get a little bit more, as I put it in my in my panels I was on, user friendly, as in I don't need to hire a whole nother engineering team to build AI, but I can leverage the tools that are out there and plug them into my system and look at my data in a different way. I think that Parsley will be one of the places where we're using AI to better understand how do we evolve human health in real time and not need to wait 60 years to bring prevention and proactive medicine kind of into day-to-day usage.
So, Robin, I'm just going to back us up a little bit because everything you're talking about makes sense to everybody, I think, here. We all want to move to the system of more prevention, and all of this sounds great. But I was seriously just on Twitter, which I think is now called X, Who knows what it will be next week? But I was getting attacked by a bunch of cardiologists, one with the Twitter handle Angry Cardiologist, which I think tells you everything you need to know. But basically, the thrust of the argument was it is not my job to do prevention. It is the patient's job to, exercise and eat well. And with the time allotted that I have, I was trained to, treat disease. And so why is everybody trying to say that like us physicians who are not trained to do this thing should be responsible for prevention? And certainly they can send you to, an STD test or a breast cancer screening on any number of the things that I think we've decided we will pay for on the prevention side. But in terms of a lot of what you're talking about, which is how do we prevent chronic disease, which we all know is lifestyle based, or at least that is a massive contributor. How do you actually convince the average physician out there that this is actually in their lane?
Well, first of all, I would agree with that angry cardiologist in that he's correct and that wasn't the job he was trained to do. And so it's a different question is to say, should that now be his job or whose job should it be? Right. And I think he's also correct in at the end of the day, only you can take care of your body, right? Literally, only you can. You can get help with that from a doctor. You can get a prescription, right? But I think there's a stat out there that says that 50% of prescriptions are never even filled at the pharmacy, right? So you have to take the drug. So I think I understand his frustration. And I also see this in the digital health world, Chrissy, that you and I and Ashu too spend a lot of time in, where we've sort of asked these four-wall brick and mortar healthcare institutions that are really good at keeping people alive to help people way outside of those four walls in the population, help them thrive. And I as a doctor and as somebody who started a couple of startups in healthcare, I'm like, this is a really hard thing to ask these institutions to do. Like hospitals aren't necessarily equipped to do that. They're not reimbursed to do that. Like, how are they supposed to figure this out? So I do think it is really, really hard. I think the answer is more around, at least from my perspective, how do we, first of all, what Parsley does is not just prevention, we're curative. We put people's autoimmune disease into remission. We resolve their hormone issues so they can get pregnant without IVF. We get their cholesterol back into normal, right? We, cure their, I did an interview earlier today for some reason on irritable bowel syndrome. We fix that in a couple of months, right? So I think we need to stop looking at such a distant time horizon and say a lot of these interventions that are leveraging highly evidence-based social determinants and lifestyle factors like nutrition, like sleep, like fitness, like exposure to technology, and putting them into the prescription pad are not just about preventing something that might happen 20 years from now. They're about radically changing the trajectory of this patient within the next 6 to 12 to 24 months. And that can happen if we deliver that kind of prescription, right? That holistic prescription in the right care model. If we put it on a piece of paper and hand it to someone and say, good luck, you're right, it's not going to happen. But I do think that we can move the needle on our population in real time, I guess.
And I like how you framed it. And Chrissy, and I have to say, in your defense, I think actually what you meant is, and I think you're using the words prevention because that is something that we have used for a long, long time because we didn't have the tools like Parsley has. We didn't have the more recent advances in digital health that we have today. I think it's exactly what you're saying, Robin. It's not, we just call it prevention, but really it's not, we're not preventing disease. A lot of the nutrition and exercise, taking care of mental health, sleep, a lot of that could be prescribed. And it is not to prevent disease, it's to perhaps slow the progression of disease, being able to live with the disease and also live longer. We say things like prevention and longevity as if there's nothing in between. What's in between is that the reality is most of us, and now with cancers such as colorectal starting in women as young as 32, most of us live with disease starting in 30. If we're lucky, if we don't get something before 30. So I don't view this as prevention either, but I think, Chrissy, what you're talking about is not actually prevention. You're advocating for a lot of the other things that right now are really important for treatment, which is not just the pill. We used to talk about beyond the pill. We stopped talking about that.
I think there is some component of prevention. Maybe I take a different point of view on this. I do agree with Robin. I think most of us talk about prevention and treatment, but there's actually like prevention, acute treatment to deal with the disease, which is what the angry cardiologist was talking about. And then there's like root cause treatment, which is where you're going, right, Robin? There are like better ways to manage that patient. But I do agree with Chrissy. I think we do need to talk about prevention because that is like, we don't really do enough of that. Some of these things can actually be prevented, but I think, we have a incentive issue in the US to deal with prevention. The problem is who's going to pay for it and whose responsibility is it? I also think it's completely unfair to take prevention and put it on like a layperson, an individual. Of course, we're responsible for our health, but there's some amount of like education needed. There's some amount of like coordination and hand holding. Like you have to be like available. And I'm not saying it's a doctor's responsibility specifically, but societal responsibility to make sure like everybody's educated on what they need to do and what do you need to eat, do you not eat processed foods, how many times should you be like eating those processed foods, what the long-term consequences are. I think it's ridiculous that we kind of exclude prevention from this conversation. There's a pervasive incentive issue in the country, and I think we must talk about that.
Hey everyone, we'll get right back to the conversation after a word from our sponsors. Is your healthcare org a tangled mess of Christmas lights? Your care teams are drowning in manual work, juggling dozens of point solutions and burning out in Excel hell, while your engineers work through a backlog bigger than a surgeon's ego. Awell is here to untangle the mess. Their care ops orchestration platform lets ops and clinical teams design, implement, and improve care flows in days, integrated seamlessly with your tech stack. The result? Automated processes, fewer soul-sucking tasks, and faster care model improvements. This year alone, Awell has orchestrated over 14 million care activities for leading organizations like Astrana Health, Commons Clinic, and Better Health. Ready to save your team from Excel hell? Visit awellhealth.com. That's AWELL health.com. And mention this podcast for a free bootcamp. They'll take you from zero to an implementable workflow in 2 days or less. Awell, make your care flows work harder than your care teams. Maybe I'll bring it back to the newsletter because the last piece that I just did was about this churn issue. And I want to talk to Robin about this as well. And Luba, you also, which is just, we don't have a system where anyone keeps the patient around for very long. Most of us change insurance every single year. Sometimes you stick on it for 2 or 3, but what can you do in 365 days? And that goes back to this question that I wanted to ask you, Robin, which is, this all sounds great, but what are the mechanisms in place today to pay for this? And then how would you like to see the system shift to be able to pay for it so that what you do can be available to everyone?
Yeah, I loved that article, Chrissy. I read it, obviously, and I think I wrote you back. I don't know if you got it. I was like, yes, spot on. So thank you for that article. In commercial insurance, which is where there's sort of that rapid turnaround, which is a lot of, although not all of the workforce, the incentives are really challenging. And the industry wants to see, from a financial perspective, totally understandably, really near-term ROI on anything that you're going to do for a patient. And so if your window of ROI is like less than 12 months and you're dealing with a patient who's going to have, one of my patients with, multiple sclerosis or lupus or one of these diseases that's going to last decades, that's a really tough time horizon to think about when the cost of that patient is going to be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars over decades. Not, a 6-month time horizon isn't the right way to think about it. So it is really challenging. And I think what we're also seeing now is with the rising costs of premiums and the cost shift from those same employers onto employees, there is like double-digit premium increases. And I think the answer is that the cost of all of this is getting shifted onto the individual. And for people who don't make as much money, it's absolutely crippling. So I think there's a reckoning coming in the cost of all of this. And I don't know if this is the right answer. It's probably the wrong answer. I tend to observe that like at the end of the day, individuals sort of push the system, like consumer demand kind of pushes the system. And as consumer expectations change, the system's sort of forced to change over time with it. And with so many people being hit so hard with the rising cost of healthcare, I feel like people are going to start demanding or expecting solutions that aren't just giving them another pill, right? Like we did this whole white paper. We interviewed 1,200 women in the workforce ages 18 to 60. Parsley commissioned this study like a year ago. And we learned some really interesting things that 80% of women are delaying care. Number one reason was time poverty. Like they don't have time to go to the doctor in their crazy busy lives. And second most common reason was not cost. I thought number one would be cost. It was actually number three. It was time. And then it was, I'm not really going to get answers. I'm just going to be given another pill. That was the thing that we heard, like the quotes. They summarized that as like, I'm going to just be sort of dismissed or unheard or not get the answers that I need in the healthcare setting. And I feel like if that's a bit of a canary in the coal mine, maybe that will push things in a different direction.
So I do want to go back, since I'm a lawyer here, just about regulation, right? We have a law, to your point, Robin, that basically says that you must give your employees and also members opportunity to switch out their payer, their insurance company every year. Why? That doesn't seem like, how could you build incentives for any insurance company if, to your point, Robin, you leave. You like it, and then somebody has lower premium. Well, the reason you had a higher premium is perhaps you paid for some of the preventative measures. And so you paid for it and you liked it, and now you went to the lower payer, and now you don't like it because you don't, you're not getting paid for some of the preventative measures. Another thing that I like that you have mentioned, just also on the incentives and going back to what is really truly prevention. If you think about, we do actually reimburse things that are prevention. Currently in the system, what gets reimbursed is if your diagnostic test, as an example, can show that it is preventing a disease. And the good example is HPV test. A good example is mammogram or colonoscopy to prevent colorectal cancer. So if you have that, then you do get prescribed and you do get tested. But there has to be two things. Number one, there has to be evidence that it actually will link to a better outcome. And number two, there has to be usually a pill and a therapeutic that can somehow help you. If, for example, you do once get a disease, it will help you also to potentially cure the disease. So there are prevention measures, but they are measured differently. So again, going back to Robin, what you're building, do you think that given all the evidence you're collecting, perhaps you will be able to incentivize payers to see that there is value in some of these, I wouldn't even call them, again, preventative measures, but measures that are augmenting the pill to improve outcomes?
Yes, we actually already have, which is super exciting. So we are the first ever root cause medicine or functional medicine clinic to be working with insurance companies. We are working with insurance companies in New York and California right now, with some nationals on the way. We're working with CVS Caremark and other similar partners. We worked with an independent actuarial firm to do an analysis of our patient population. And twice now, actually, they've shown in two 10,000 patient data sets that Parsley's model and care directly is reducing total cost of care by upwards of 30% in a population that's quite high cost. And we've actually worked with the insurance companies now. And what's really cool is obviously they have way bigger data sets than we do. Their data sets are in the millions, ours are in the tens of thousands. And we've really seen how there's this segment of the population, these folks who have two or more conditions usually, and these folks are about 20-25% of the workforce, and that this group is really high cost, and that this group is costing about 5x the average of a commercially insured person, and that this group's rising costs are going through the roof at a faster rate than everybody else. And we've actually gotten this data from some of the large employers that we've worked with. And then our actuarial model has shown that our care bends that cost curve. And so we're in the early days of this, but one of the reasons I started the company, I said exactly what you said, right? This medicine makes sense, right? And it's kind of being practiced here and there. And now the Cleveland Clinic's doing it, right? This it seems just logical, right? Everyone says that to me. Isn't this how medicine should be? And I'm like, well, yes, but, and I wouldn't even say it's how primary care should be or specialty care should be or hospitals should be, right? I think it's just a different way of approaching the patient, right? This idea of asking why, because I think, again, some primary care does a great job for patients and some specialty care is doing awesome, right? But we're missing this segment of healthcare that's helping reverse chronic disease, not just prevent it. It's prevention and disease reversal or attenuation, modification. And so we've actually been able to show that. And so when I started the company, I said, well, let's start direct to consumer. Let's kind of figure out our model, figure out how this works, start to do it at scale. It was also important to me to prove that people wanted this kind of care. I said, well, if nobody really wants it, then what's the point of trying to take it into insurance companies and employers and so forth? But I said that with the intention of ultimately working with payers, and now we're here, which is crazy.
Well, I have to say, I'm sure everybody in the audience, and I certainly, I'm sure Ash and Chrissy would love to know two things. One is, what is that preventative measure or magic bullet? Perhaps a special nutrition or a special number of hours or something that does improve outcomes. And two is, what are these comorbidities? Is it mental health? Is it other chronic diseases, autoimmune disease, cancer? I would love to learn that.
So the conditions that we're treating the most of, there's a lot that fall into this category, but I'll list kind of the big buckets. And I think everyone can relate. And I won't ask you all to share this for privacy, but I think we all can, when I list these conditions, everyone, I will say, I know someone or I have that, right? So the big categories for us are autoimmune, GI, gastrointestinal conditions, cardiometabolic, which I lump together, but that's everything cardiovascular health. It's also diabetes. It's also weight gain. Behavioral health is a huge one for us. We actually help 25% of people with mental health conditions get off of their medications because about 25% of mental health conditions actually start in the body. They're more physically driven than mentally driven, but that's often missed in our healthcare system. And then the last big category is hormonal endocrine. So I mean, not diabetes specifically, I put that in metabolic, but PCOS, endometriosis, infertility, menopause, thyroid, lots of different hormonal conditions. There's others, neurological conditions, migraine, and so forth, but those are the big ones that kind of fall into that, what we call high and rising risk category. And then the other question you asked is, what's the one thing you can do to radically shift your risk of or begin to improve these conditions if you have them? I find in our practice, and our data shows this, that nutrition is number one. Most people are eating a highly inflammatory, highly processed diet. Average American eats 152 pounds of sugar a year. 60% to 70% of the American diet, including kids, is ultra processed or ultra refined. These are not real foods. They're Franken foods, and they are toxic to the body, and they are disruptive to all of the things, the body systems I just mentioned, the immune system, the gut, the brain, the hormones, right? So if you take that away and you eat real, whole, unprocessed foods, you give the body a shot at beginning to shift the trajectory of a lot of these conditions. Now, that is certainly, food is not the only thing, but it's a really big lever that we have.
So I'm going to wrap us up with a final question, and that's, Robin, I would be remiss not to mention your excellent newsletter where you really break down a lot of what is going on in the world of what you just mentioned, nutrition, but you also talk about hormones, you talk about exercise. You know, I think your latest dispatch was all about cortisol and the role that plays in the body. So tell us what the purpose is of doing this kind of work, and then maybe give us one example of something that a lot of people don't know about that you've learned through this kind of research that would be great for our listeners to know about.
So thanks for calling me out. I write this in addition to Parsley having a great newsletter. I've been, since last year, writing my own newsletter every couple of weeks, mainly because I'm sure you all relate to this, right? We all have so many things that we're doing. And 150% of my time that isn't devoted to my 3 children is building and growing Parsley Health. But I started as a doctor, right? And this subject matter, all of this health and wellness and medical information, I love, right? It's like what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's what I nerd out on. It's what I like to talk about. And so I write a newsletter every couple of weeks that sort of deep dives into a topic that I'm just hearing about lately, is maybe come up in some of the patients that I'm seeing, mainly because it gives me joy to write about this stuff. And then I hope that some of the information is actually useful. And so you mentioned the cortisol one, which is the most recent one. So I'll jump onto that because I saw this Wall Street Journal article on cortisol, and it was very light. Love you, Wall Street Journal. You're doing great, but it was a very light article. And cortisol is one of these sort of forgotten hormones. Like when we talk about hormones, we think about progesterone and testosterone and estrogen, but we've forgotten the adrenals. And since everyone's a woman on this podcast right now, and we're talking about hormones, I'm going to remind us that adrenals are queen, and this is a matriarchal society. So adrenals in charge, and your brain is talking to your adrenals, or to two little glands that sit on top of your kidneys all the time. And your adrenals are responsible for many things, but one of them is pumping out cortisol, which is our stress response. And cortisol doesn't just impact our stress and our heart rate and our blood sugar and our metabolism and our immune system, but then it has all these downstream effects on our sex hormones like progesterone and can therefore impact fertility. It has all these downstream impacts on our thyroid. And so when adrenals are queen and we don't in medicine routinely look to understand what's happening with cortisol over the course of the day, we sometimes miss changes not in our cortisol as from a disease perspective, but from a functional perspective that's really making us have symptoms like irregular periods and having a hard time getting pregnant and feeling exhausted all the time and having a hard time getting out of bed. So I thought the WSJ could have gone deeper. So I decided to do it for them. I don't know if they care, and wrote deeply about this topic. And so if there's one takeaway, it's to remember that cortisol is a big driver of our other hormones. It's a hormone that we don't look at traditionally in medicine. And so if you can work with a doctor like Parsley, we'll actually do either a urine or a saliva test and look at how your cortisol is performing, not to diagnose you with a disease, but to understand how is your body functioning in response to this life that you are currently living. And there's a lot of things we can do to intervene around that to help you feel better.
Awesome. Robin, thanks so much. That was such a engaging conversation. I love how you're thinking about disease management and working with patients holistically. As a physician and a patient, this is how care should be. So love that you're leading the way here. And I'm really rooting for Parsley Health. Would love to have you come back and see us soon and tell us how things are going. To all of our listeners, thanks for listening in, and goodbye from your hosts, Christina Farr, Luba Greenwood, and me, Ash Sanuz. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Second Opinion. Share it with colleagues and friends and message us to let us know what topics you want to discuss on the podcast. If you want to support the show, the best ways are to leave a review wherever you're listening and make sure you are subscribed. And check out Christina's Second Opinion newsletter on Beehive. A link to subscribe is in the episode description. Second Opinion is part of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Turpentine VC, Age of Miracles, and more shows for experts by experts in tech.
Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.